So as you can see, I now have my paper to where both of my 1-inch columns on the outer edge have their lines, their horizontal lines, going all the way across every 1/8 of an inch. So now with this space in the middle, I'm going to show you how to begin this intersection here, which is where the project becomes actually quite interesting. So your first step is to draw 5 lines of some sort in the middle. Wavy, diagonal. So we're going to actually put 4 on this particular page, depending on the size of your paper. As you can see, this paper is pretty large. It's a 9 by 12. Which is about the size that you'll be getting in class if you are working on this in class. So now you've got your diagonal lines. Or your wavy lines, or whatever type of line you put in there. So then our next step is going to take us into this type of scenario. So hopefully you guys can see that a little bit if I lift it up. And then we'll eventually head to this type of a scenario where we've got more of the lines and eventually here. So once we get to this step, our next line that we're going to put is one that's just kind of near the middle somewhere. That way we kind of have a middle point and we have all of our wavy, weird, wonky lines, because what that's going to do is give us sort of a meeting point from one diagonal line to the next. So this next part is where it does start to get just a little bit tricky. So I'm going to actually try to zoom in a little bit so you can see a little bit better of what I am doing. Hopefully that works. And then I'm going to go from each of these points and I'm going to draw a diagonal line to touch this wavy line here. Now keep in mind, if I go down here, all of these lines are going to go down in some sort of angle until I get to this line, at which point they will then start going the opposite direction, so they'll go up. So I'm going to just start with some diagonal lines. You do not want them to all be exactly the same angle. They will kind of start out sort of parallelly, but they won't end up that way. So notice that I am not using a ruler right now. Later on, when we go over these lines with a pen, you will use a ruler. But to just get them onto the paper is actually much more effective to do it without a ruler, otherwise it just takes too long. So notice here my lines are starting to touch. That's okay. What that's going to do is kind of create a shadow there where those lines end up closer together. So now I'm starting to get pretty close to that wavy line. So I want my lines to now basically all come to a point here, but not quite to that point. Oops, bring that one a little closer. So it's okay to go a little bit below that area before you start coming back up. But now essentially I'm going to turn my page just because that makes an easier angle for me to be able to work. And they're going to start to even out until they start to drop the other direction. So now I'm going to turn the page again. So feel free to turn the page as often as you need to, because I want you to turn the page however is going to help you the most. So you can see they're spacing out a little bit more, but they're starting to get a little bit too flat. So what I'm going to do is then start having them come closer together on that wavy line. So you see now the angle of that line is increasing again. It's becoming a sharper angle. So now I've done basically that whole first diagonal space in here. You can see my lines all go down, they start to kind of even out, and then they start to go up. So then in my next column over, what's going to happen is I'm going to go from this weird wavy line up. So now it's going to all go up on this part. And then once they start dipping down here, it's going to go the opposite way. So essentially you're kind of making a bunch of V's. Now in here I know it's going to get a little bit tricky. So I'm going to go ahead and get started in the areas where I can, and then show you something that you can do to help yourselves if that also happens to your piece. So you do want to make sure that you're actually touching that diagonal line or your wavy line, so that when you are going the other direction you can know exactly where to start. So I have a couple spots where I've had to fix that. Okay, so in here is sort of my problem area, if you will, right in this area here. So what I'm actually going to do is take my ruler and go ahead and sharpen those lines. I'm going to go ahead and make them darker so they're more visible. And now I have a very definite starting and stopping point. So you can see that those lines are starting to separate themselves a little bit more because now they're perfectly straight. Whereas when I was drawing them, they were not. So you can see a little bit more about where their actual end point is, which will make it much easier when I get into my next step. Now I have had some students say that they prefer to just work directly with the ruler from the beginning. That's perfectly fine if that is your preference. So I'm just going to continue cleaning up some of these lines so that I can make sure I have a separate point for each of them. So now these two are going to touch, and that's perfectly fine. I just need to know that I have 3 lines coming from this point. So now I can see a little bit better where these lines are actually going to be starting as they go in the opposite direction on this side. So again, if you want to go right in with your ruler, I'm going to show you how that would look. Because that is a perfectly fine option. So these lines are very close together. So then remember we have 3 lines from this point. So then they're going to start to drip down so that they can start going in the opposite direction. So essentially that is what it would look like if you were using a ruler from the beginning. It's perfectly fine to do it either way. You will eventually be using a ruler. So your next video, I'm just going to show you some more of working in this section. I'm not going to talk through it. It's just going to be watching so that you can understand a little bit of how the process works.